Yeah. Well, I had Jeremy and Christopher in the same class, and we were talking about twins and stuff in that class as well. All right, so let's talk about the respiratory system. So the respiratory system is related and connected to the circulatory system. They have to work together. And the function of the respiratory system is to provide our body with oxygen that it needs. If you remember back when we talked about cells, guys, when we talked about cells, we said that in the mitochondria, oxygen is needed to break down glucose and get energy out of it. This is why every single cell in our body must have a constant supply of oxygen. And so our respiratory system is what helps to get that oxygen into our blood so that can be delivered. Also, the respiratory system acts as kind of an excretory organ, getting rid of waste. And what is the waste that it gets rid of? Julia?
Carbon dioxide.
Yeah, it gets rid of carbon dioxide. If you remember when we talked about respiration, what's one of the things produced in respiration and released?
Oxygen, carbon dioxide.
It uses oxygen, uses glucose. It produces CO2 and water and ATP. So that carbon dioxide, if it were to build up in our cells, it becomes toxic. And so our body has to get rid of it.
Is that why you can't breathe it?
What's that?
Is that why you can't like breathe it?
Yeah, you can't, well, you need the oxygen, also you need to be able to release the carbon dioxide, yes. So we breathe in and out. Obviously our lungs are involved, but our lungs don't just inflate and deflate on their own. We have a muscle that allows that to happen. That muscle is called the diaphragm. It's kind of a strange shape, shaped like a parachute. It's like a sheet of muscle that's tucked in underneath the rib cage. And when it contracts and relaxes, that's what causes us to breathe in and out. When it drops down, okay, creates a low pressure in our chest, and that's what brings air into our lungs. Then when it relaxes, it allows us to exhale. So you see in this picture, as it contracts and moves down, the lungs fill with air, and as it relaxes. So a couple of things related to the diaphragm. It's a muscle. Is it under voluntary control or involuntary? Both, right? Most of the time, you're not thinking about your breathing, but right now you probably are. And now it's under your conscious control, and you have to say, oh, I better breathe in. And so if you're kind of thinking about it, you have to decide when to breathe in and when to breathe out. But if you're not, then you just kind of do it on your own. Also, a couple other things. One is sometimes you can get hit in the back or fall, and your diaphragm gets temporarily sort of disabled or paralyzed for just a few seconds. That's when you get the wind knocked out of you. And it's because your diaphragm's kind of a little bit sort of stunned because of a blow to the back. And if you ever had that happen, it's really scary. You feel like you can't breathe because you can't. It doesn't last long, but it seems to because you're like freaking out, right? Because you can't breathe. But after, 5 or 6 seconds, you start to breathe.
Permanently happen?
No, I mean, I've never heard of that permanently.
I know, it's not like drugs in my chest.
Yeah, and did you get the wind knocked out of you? Yeah. The other thing is a hiccup. Hiccups, when a person gets the hiccup, it's caused by their diaphragm sort of spasming every once in a while, and that sound creates that hiccup.
How many points in the homework?
5. So, if we look here at this fine gentleman, breathing, as we breathe in air from this room, the contents of the air, so air is a mixture of gases, right? It's not just pure oxygen in this room. In fact, most of the air in this room is nitrogen, 78%. About 21% is oxygen, and a small percentage, this is actually a little off, less than 1% is carbon dioxide. So the air we breathe in has that composition. Once we bring that air into our lungs, okay, the blood going near our lungs is taking oxygen out of that air, putting carbon dioxide into it. Then if you were to measure the air we exhale, it's different. Some of the oxygen has been removed, and some carbon dioxide has been put into it. Okay? And so as we breathe in and out, that's how the air changes. So breathing is like this mechanical process of bringing air into our lungs, okay, so that the oxygen and carbon dioxide can diffuse into our blood. So when you breathe in, you obviously can breathe in through your nose or through your mouth. So which is better?
Your mouth? Well, they're the same, right?
They're not quite the same. There are some benefits to one.
The mouth is closer, isn't it?
Well, just a tiny bit, but that doesn't affect it really. There's a benefit to breathing through your nose.
Because less carbon dioxide.
No. Do you know why? Any clue? Imagine Mr. Arcari, and this might give you a clue. He has a lot of this.
Oh, snot.
And nose hair, yes.
Yeah, and it
Yes.
just affects.
Mucus in the nose and nose hair. Both, what do those things do?
They clean it, take away the.
Yeah, as we breathe air in through our nose hairs, mucus in there, they might call snot, boogers, help to trap little bits of dust and little bits of pollen and things that are in the air. And so as it goes through our nose, some of that stuff gets filtered out. And then the air going into our lungs, it has less of that. Breathing through your mouth, you don't have as much of that air being filtered. So it's a little filter. Our nasal cavity up here connects in the back of our throat to the tube that brings air down into our lungs. That's called the trachea. You might have heard it called the windpipe. Okay, it's right at the front of your neck. That's your windpipe. That's your trachea. Okay. And it carries the air down, heading towards your lungs. It's reinforced with rings of cartilage because it's important that it can stay open, that it doesn't get damaged, because obviously if your windpipe, if your trachea gets damaged, then you can't get air into your lungs. What if something gets stuck in the trachea? Yeah, that's what choking is. Choking is when some object gets lodged in the trachea and a person can't get air in their lungs. So if you're eating a delicious veggie burger or something,
Ew.
and a chunk got stuck in your throat, could you just breathe through your nose? No, because where it's stuck is blocking the flow of air through your nose and through your mouth. So you can't just like breathe through your nose if you're choking on something. You have to dislodge that.
Ross, you're never gonna try meat again.
We can go through this all the time, Alex. No, I don't think so.
I'd rather eat a steak.
Okay, great. So the trachea brings this air down. It's a large tube going through the center of our chest, main passageway to our lungs. And it's reinforced with these rings of cartilage. And then it splits into two large branches. They're called bronchi. And then those two large branches split further and further. Just like a tree, just like blood vessels, as they split off, they get smaller and smaller. These small little tubes are called bronchioles. Does this sound familiar? Where have you maybe heard that?
Like brachial, or like starts the dinosaur.
No?
Bronchitis.
Bronchitis. So bronchitis is when a person has an infection in their respiratory system that's affecting these bronchial tubes where they can get congested, infected, bacteria and mucus can build up. So these branches get smaller, smaller, smaller. Eventually they end in these little clusters. They almost look like a cluster of grapes. These are called alveoli. They're air sacs. They're at the very end. And this is where the capillaries are surrounding them. And this is where material can diffuse in and out of our blood, in these alveoli. Sometimes people mistakenly think our lungs are just like two plastic bags that kind of inflate and deflate. That's not at all how they look. They have they're really made of these clusters of these alveoli, which those tiny little air sacs inflate and deflate as we breathe in and out. And this is where material can move into our blood, oxygen, and carbon dioxide can move out. So, still got it right? So the alveoli, if you see them, okay, this is from the body's exhibit. These are the lungs. You see that they're completely composed of alveoli. And so if you imagine what's happening, as we breathe in, air goes into these individual air sacs, and they inflate. As they inflate with fresh air that we're breathing in, the capillaries are running right next to them. And so as our capillaries are running next to these alveoli, material can move in and out. Carbon dioxide can come out of our blood and go into this air. At the same time, oxygen from this air can diffuse into our blood, and then our red blood cells can pick it up and take it away to be delivered throughout the body. So the back of your trachea has a little covering called the epiglottis. That's important. And what does this little flap do? Okay?
It makes sure that food doesn't go into your
Yeah, exactly. As you have food in your mouth and you're swallowing food, if you just have your trachea and esophagus kind of right next to each other, well, it could be very likely that food goes down your trachea and you can be choking. So the epiglottis is a little flap that covers the trachea so that food doesn't go in there. And it opens up when we breathe in and out, but it closes when we're not. And so that prevents food from getting in there. Sometimes, though, you accidentally, if you've been drinking a glass of water, you might accidentally inhale some of that water, okay? And then you start coughing because coughing is your body's reaction to something being in your trachea, which you're trying to expel.
So why can't you breathe through your nose when you're drinking?
Because when you're
Without it getting-
because that air you're breathing in through your nose is going down your trachea at the same time. So that flap is closed, so you can't. And so this is why we don't choke. So you see, as this person's chewing up this food, goes down. This is the epiglottis. It closes over this trachea as that food is swallowed so that the food can go down the esophagus and not the trachea. Do you ever hear people say, oh, they drink water, it went down the wrong pipe?
Yeah.
it's so big.
So what does that mean?
The one in the trachea.
Yeah, that some water went down the trachea rather than the
So when you're sick,
esophagus.
when you're sick and you cough, is that something's in your trachea? Like,
Yeah, well, because when you get sick and you have some sort of infection, bacteria are building up sort of in your lungs and your trachea and the bronchi, and our body's reaction to that is to produce mucus. And so, like, when you cough and you're coughing up material, that's because your body's trying to remove those bacteria and pathogens.
Where's the damage when you like smoke or use tobacco?
Yeah, so smoking and emphysema, those sorts of things, good question. Lead us to our next slide. So smoking, okay,
Wait, what about the?
are those real lungs?
yeah, so these are actual lungs. So smoking cigarettes, when the person smokes cigarettes, they take in lots of different chemicals. So in tobacco, there's lots of different chemicals. There's nicotine, which is what people get addicted to. There's also tars and lots of other materials that come when you burn something that get in your lungs and they build up. All these things are bad for your lungs. They cause your alveoli to shrink and be less elastic. Tar and material from tobacco can build up in the lungs, and that leads to them sort of losing their function over time, and certainly increases drastically the risk of what? Well, a heart attack and lung cancer. Okay, lung cancer is very tightly linked to smoking. The other thing is that sometimes people think that vaping or juuling is better than smoking cigarettes because, well, you're not burning something, but you're also inhaling chemicals in vaping. Now, it's different sorts of chemicals. There's still obviously nicotine, but there's other chemicals that also influence the functioning of the lung. Not the tars and stuff that are in cigarettes, but other materials that scientists are starting to find damage the lungs and lead to lung problems in the long term. And also, cigarettes have been studied for a long time, whereas e-cigs and vaping, those things are relatively new. So scientists and doctors haven't had 30 or 40 years to study the effects of those other types of nicotine products to really understand what the risks are as well. So it's not a safe alternative to smoking, as my lesson here. Okay?
My grandpa got lung cancer, and actually I'm pretty sure they couldn't get it out, so they actually had to do surgery and cut off a piece of his lung.
Yeah. So.
Is that doing any changes to his lung?
Yeah, so people sometimes lose functioning of a part of the lung. In that situation, of lung cancer, they may have to remove the portions of the lung that had these cancerous growths in them. And then a person can live with part of their lung removed or even with a whole lung removed, and the other lung can sort of take over some of the function of the other. It's not as good, obviously. Sometimes, if your lungs aren't functioning properly, you might have oxygen. If you've ever seen somebody has to tow behind a little oxygen tank and have a little tube that they go because their lungs are not functioning to get enough oxygen out of the air we breathe, so they get sort of enriched. They enrich that with oxygen from an oxygen tank to help keep their oxygen levels in their blood up. Asthma is something else common that probably many people have experienced or know people with asthma. Asthma is when the airways, these bronchioles that are leading into the alveoli, they have muscle around them, okay? And sometimes when a person has asthma, okay, for some reason these muscles, these sort of contract and they narrow the pathway leading into these alveoli. So obviously, with a wide open airway, you can get plenty of oxygen, air into your lungs to get oxygen. As that airway constricts, okay, as a person with asthma, the wall becomes inflamed and that airway narrows and it's harder to get air into the alveoli. And an asthma attack, so a person might have just general asthma where it's a little more difficult to breathe. When they're having an asthma attack, then these airways are severely narrowed and those smooth muscles are also contracting, making it very, very difficult to get air to those alveoli. Air gets trapped there and that pathway gets reduced. And so an inhaler that people take, some of you might have an inhaler or you know people, is another word for those medications. They're called bronchodilators. So what do you think that means? Bronchi is what? Yeah, it's these tubes. Dilate. What does that mean?
I know when you go to the eye doctor, sometimes they put something to dilate your
Yes.
eyes, just make your pupils bigger.
Yeah, it makes your pupils bigger. Okay? Dilate means to open up something. Okay? And so a bronchodilator is a medication you breathe in through an inhaler, and it causes these airways, the bronchioles, to dilate and open up a little bit to make it easier to breathe. Christian?
My mom had bronchitis before, and the doctor made her have an inhaler.
Yeah, because bronchitis also can cause those passages to narrow, and so that bronchodilator, that asthma inhaler, helps to open them up in that case, just like it would with a person that has asthma. So has anyone ever taken a test for like asthma at the doctor? My daughter used to go for allergy shots, and every time she have to breathe, you have to breathe as hard as you can into this little tube, and it has a little meter that shows how much air you're expelling. It helps give an idea about your lung functioning and whether or not you may have some constrictions.
Didn't we do that when they thought I had like pneumonia?
Yeah, they're doing that as a test for your lung function. So to see if you have pneumonia or if you have asthma or allergies and so forth. So phlegm that we cough up from our lungs is, again, it's caused by mucus. Phlegm is mucus that can build up in the alveoli, in the bronchioles, in the bronchi, and as we cough, we're sort of expelling that out through the trachea. So just mention pneumonia. Pneumonia is a lung infection, okay? It's caused by bacteria that get into the lungs, and fluid starts to build up in these alveoli. And obviously, if these alveoli are filled with fluid, you're not going to be able to get the oxygen that you need because they're not going to inflate with air. They're filled with fluid. If you've ever heard people saying they have fluid in their lungs, okay, that's because it's more difficult to get up that oxygen when that happens.
How do you get the fluid out?
You cough, okay, or you go on like an antibiotics, and over time the bacteria die, and then that fluid starts to be reabsorbed or removed from the lungs. Basically, have to cough it up, basically. All right, any questions about the respiratory system? Save the best for last. All right.